From the New York Times, this is The New Washington. I'm Michael Barbaro. Today, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand.
And Hillary Clinton is our speaker. And she looks out into the room and she says, decisions are made every day in Washington. And if you are not involved in those decisions and you don't like what they decide, you have no one to blame but yourself. I realize that for many New Yorkers, this is the first time you've heard my name and you don't know much about me. Many here don't believe the victims. They don't believe the victims. This shows that there is still not good order and discipline in our military, and it shows that our system is broken because it protects predators. It fails to protect victims.
I'm honored now to introduce my colleague on the Senate side, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from the great state of New York.
Thank you. All of us rely on extraordinary staff members to help us accomplish the work that our constituents elect us to do. They're talented, they're passionate about public service, and many of them are just beginning their careers. But over the last few weeks, more and more current and former congressional staffers are coming out and bravely telling their stories about how they experienced sexual harassment while working here. This is shameful.
Jennifer Steinhauer, Kirsten Gillibrand, the junior Democratic senator from New York, introduced two pieces of legislation this week that feel quite relevant to where we are as a country and a culture. Can you tell me about those two bills?
So the first bill, it's the Me Too bill, and it's a companion bill with the House that would basically try to unravel some of the very archaic and frankly bizarre rules around how sexual harassment is dealt with on Capitol Hill.
The system to address this problem is virtually unknown to most staffers. It's very confusing to navigate and is tilted against victims.
There's these long waiting periods that accusers have to go through, sort of a mediation with the person they're accusing before they can even file a complaint. So Capitol Hill is in some ways very bizarre. It's consistent with other institutions that are inherently biased, generally speaking, against the victim in some way, against the accuser.
Obviously, we have an enormous problem about sexual assault in this country, and the military is perhaps the worst and most egregious.
And the military side of things, Senator Gillibrand for a long time has been trying to get legislation passed that would remove the authority for prosecuting, adjudicating sexual assault, sexual harassment claims in the military, basically putting it into prosecutors' hands, kind of more mirroring how things go in civilian life.
We're seeing a high number of civilian victims as well as military victims, a low prosecution rate of sexual assault cases, and no improvement in the rate of retaliation against those who are brave enough to come forward.
All these institutions, in some sense, have a common thread, in her view, which is that the system seems sort of stacked against the person making the accusation.
So, Jennifer, Gillibrand is tackling how two very male-dominated institutions in American life are handling allegations of sexual assault. The first being Capitol Hill itself, both branches of Congress and all the staff there and the members, and then the United States military.
And I would add sexual harassment to that, too. I would say it's a pretty broad set of issues.
It was funny. A friend of mine just wrote an email to her boss, who she used to work for in New York City, and she recounted all of the times she was harassed by colleagues, by clients, and how she reported all the damage.
Jennifer, tell me about your history of covering Senator Kirsten Gillibrand.
So when I arrived in Washington to cover Congress in 2010, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand was a newly minted senator from New York who was very much in the shadow both of the person whose seat she took, Hillary Clinton, and Chuck Schumer, the senior senator from New York. And understanding that, she quickly attached herself to a number of both local and national issues, and one of them was sexual assault in the military.
And we had a woman testify today at our press conference about her daughter who was molested by someone who had a record of other sexual harassment, sexual assault cases. And when the military could have punished him, they promoted him instead.
As a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, she was quick to grab onto that issue and to be extremely active in writing bills designed to combat that problem in light of data that had come out a few years ago showing a very large number of women and men had been assaulted in the military. And she really worked tirelessly on that issue. She also took that passion and that interest to the issue of sexual assault on campuses, which was obviously picked up by the Obama administration, and she worked closely with them on that. Now, when the Republicans took control of the Senate, even though that bill would surface now and then, there was just less focus on that in more recent years. So now I think she smartly and correctly sees an opportunity to raise these issues again. So that's been one of her signature issues, and that's principally what I've covered with her.
How much, since you first arrived at the Hill, how much have you seen change? What would you observe as the biggest changes that you've noted as a lawmaker and as a female lawmaker?
Well, this debate about sexual assault, sexual harassment has only grown in the last 5 years. It's really metastasized into all of society at this point. I had my press conference today on reintroducing military justice, and I really look at that context as one of the most important because these are men and women who are willing to give their lives for the country, and we haven't created a military justice system worthy of their sacrifice.
So talk about that and tell folks a little bit, just remind them how that issue works, because not everybody is really aware of the intricacies of this.
Right. So in the military today, if you are assaulted, you can report that crime wherever you like, but the person who decides whether or not there's enough evidence of the crime having been committed is your commander. Someone up the chain of command from you is the one who decides whether to move it forward to trial. And unfortunately, a lot of these commanders have absolutely no training to do criminal justice. They often have biases. What we've seen over and over again, their instincts are to often do non-judicial punishment, meaning I'll dock your pay, I'll make you clean the latrines, I'll make you do something else, but not a punishment appropriate for rape. And so as a result, last year there were about 6,000 cases reported, about 4,000 of them reported openly, but only 2% of those cases that were reported actually ended in conviction. So 98% of the time, those service members aren't getting justice. And the worst part of this fact pattern is that among all those that reported, 59% said they were retaliated against for reporting. So what our bill very simply does is take the decision-making out of the chain of command and give it to trained military prosecutors who know what they're doing, who will care about the civilians, who will care about whether this predator can become a recidivist and do the crime over and over again.
So obviously, you are very closely associated with this bill concerning the military. You worked also at some point on issues around assault on campuses, sexual assault, and you are now involved in looking at sexual harassment here on the Hill. What, Senator, do you see as sort of a common thread with all these institutionally? Does it have to do with power? What do you see working on these issues that is just very familiar?
Yes, it is a huge common thread. Institutions protect the powerful within them. Institutions want to protect the status quo. So really, it doesn't matter which institution it is. You'll see it in Congress. You see it in the military. You look at other institutions. You look at Hollywood, all the non-disclosure agreements that women were forced to sign. You look at Wall Street. You look at any place where you have institutional bias in favor of the powerful, in favor of the predator, in favor of the status quo, you don't have transparency or accountability.
So I think what's really interesting is that Senator Gillibrand in some ways is a symbol of generational change. She's one of the younger lawmakers and certainly one of the younger female lawmakers in the Senate now. And she is trying to not just find but raise her legislative voice on issues that have historically been pretty difficult. I mean, women and members have been trying for years to address the issue of sexual assault in the military and frankly haven't gotten very far and haven't even really attempted to deal with the problems on Capitol Hill. And so she's taking on these two institutions at a time, I mean, not many people now are going to ignore the idea that you should be addressing sexual harassment on Capitol Hill. There's just no appetite to resist that right now. The military is different because you're talking about authority and longstanding traditions. So I still think that's more difficult. But again, she's picked issues in an environment that frankly, are far less hostile to them than they would have been 10 or even probably 5 years ago.
The newest sexual harassment scandal in Washington hits a well-known Democratic senator. Minnesota's Al Franken is asking for an ethics investigation into his own behavior.
She says, quote, "He came at me, put his hand on the back of my head, mashed his lips against mine, and aggressively stuck his tongue in my mouth." And
Jennifer, your conversation with Gillibrand about sexual harassment on Capitol Hill happened almost exactly around the time that a woman made a very public allegation against Senator Al Franken.
So we went to interview Senator Gillibrand just a few hours after these revelations became public.
Another day, another allegation. Were you surprised to hear this allegation against Senator Franken?
I was, and I was, I mean, it's very disturbing. I was very disappointed. But it's important that survivors are coming out and speaking truth to power and telling their stories, because we need to support those survivors and believe them.
I don't think that Senator Gillibrand and Senator Franken are great buddies, but they're friendly. They're obviously in the same caucus. And she seemed truly, legitimately disturbed, and she immediately donated all the money his PAC had ever given her to Protect Our Defenders, which is a group that deals with sexual assault in the military, which I thought was pretty clever, actually.
What do you think he should do?
Well, I think it's appropriate that there is an ethics committee investigation, and I think it's important that we follow that process and see what facts there are.
And in terms of elected officials, there's been some interesting, provocative work, some of it by liberal journalists. In fact, I assume you've read some of it, who've suggested, are kind of relitigating the Clinton period and suggesting that Bill Clinton his behavior paved the way for men to continue to behave this way in the workplace and beyond, and that we should rethink what happened. And the liberals who supported President Clinton, and I know you are a huge supporter of Hillary, obviously, during the campaign, and this came up to some degree. What's your view of that?
Well, I think what we've learned from this moment is it's not any one president, it's not any one industry, and that this is exceedingly prevalent and very pervasive, and we need to have a very different conversation than we've had in the past. Whether it was President Clinton, whether it was the Anita Hill hearings, or whether it's President Trump's allegations.
Do you think that we'd be in a different place right now had President Clinton resigned?
I don't know. I think this has been a problem we've had in society, certainly in my entire life, but we've never had a conversation this important. And it couldn't come too soon because, as you've seen, whether we're talking about the military context or college campuses or Congress, lives are destroyed, and it has to change. And one of the reasons why I fight so hard for women in leadership is because I think if you change the players list in all of these institutions, you're going to change the climate.
But just to be clear, so is it your view that the President Clinton should have stepped down at that time, given the allegations?
Yes, I think that is the appropriate response.
We'll be right back.
I was scared. I knew the state trooper was sitting outside, or I'm pretty sure he was sitting out there. And I was just very scared. He told me he knew my boss. This was the governor.
Jones claims that Mr. Clinton then exposed himself to her and explicitly requested she perform a sex act.
Jennifer, you mentioned to Gillibrand that there is a renewed conversation about President Bill Clinton, who, of course, has been accused of sexual assault by multiple women. I want to go back to that era for a moment that you're asking Gillibrand about. What did the public and the political world know about these allegations against Bill Clinton?
So the allegations against Bill Clinton really stemmed from research, Oppo research, if you will, from right-leaning groups that were basically, they did have an agenda to get at Bill Clinton. And as a result, and because, frankly, of that time period when it was difficult for women in any situation to be believed in making sexual harassment and assault claims, particularly against elected officials, they were largely dismissed, and they were certainly dismissed by Democrats who basically, including women and feminists, circled the wagons around Bill Clinton and viewed all these accusations as some form of, right-wing conspiracy. Now, the Monica Lewinsky situation, to this day, Ms. Lewinsky said that she doesn't feel that she was harassed. She was much more upset about the aftermath of it, and I think she called it the political machine that followed. But nonetheless, obviously, there's been a re-examination of that relationship, which at the time, again, Democrats viewed as, they didn't defend it. They found it inappropriate. They found it terrible, immoral, and kind of gross, but not criminal. And the power relationship between the president of the United States and an intern was remarked upon, and it was derided. But I don't think the framework was quite there the way we have it now, where we think of these things, if not criminal, certainly, fireable offenses in any other industry, in any other part of American life. And so I think why people are looking back at Bill Clinton is they're thinking, did not framing it that way, did not seizing that, just that specific power relationship as looking at that rather than the lies or the nature of their interactions, just that alone, by dismissing that as an issue, did that kind of pave the way for sexual harassment to continue to be dismissed even at a higher level. So I wanted to press her on the issue because she seemed to be having a pre-existing or just that moment mental space to consider how things would have been different and how she would have felt about it, a lawmaker at that time, and how she looks at it in retrospect.
But just to be clear, so is it your view that the President Clinton should have stepped down at that time, given the allegations?
Yes, I think that is the appropriate response. But I think things have changed today, and I think under those circumstances, there should be a very different reaction.
Now, I can't tell you whether she came to that conclusion in the course of that conversation, or this is something that she decided she was sort of willing to go there, if you will, in our talk. I can't know that. But I thought it was very interesting, and she paused long enough to let me know that she understood that there would be some consequences for her in stating that.
Well, let me talk to you about that pause, because it's one of the more pregnant and meaningful pauses I've listened to in quite some time. What did you think was going through her mind as she thought about how to answer your question?
So I want to be careful in answering that because I never want to try and say what someone else is or was thinking. I just don't think it's fair, and I don't think I could possibly do so accurately. I'm trying to stick to the facts. But I can tell you what my impression was. And my impression was that she was doing one of two things. She was either formulating her answer for the first time and figuring out how she wanted to say it, or she was craving to express her opinion and trying to think through in real time what the danger was in expressing it. And I'm not going to put my finger on the scale of which one of those two things it was. Or maybe it was something completely different. But that was my impression.
Because, of course, complicating a lot of this is the fact that Senator Gillibrand and the Clintons are pretty close. Not just Hillary Clinton, whose seat Gillibrand took, but Bill Clinton, for that matter. And both seem to have a pretty big impact on her political career.
Absolutely. I mean, besides the donations, obviously, she's had a close relationship with them, being the senator from New York, as Hillary Clinton was, as you just noted. But also, she was a very early supporter of Hillary Clinton in her race for the White House. And she talked about it in very personal terms, not just that she thought Hillary Clinton would be a great leader and a great president, but how much she had learned from her, how much she had been inspired by her as a female lawmaker, and how much she had felt supported by her. And she made similar, though obviously not as extensive, comments about Bill Clinton, but clear that the Clinton family had supported her. And I think in that sense, that made it obviously all the more difficult for her to say what she did. And I'm quite certain she probably has no interest in offending Hillary Clinton. But I also think it's interesting that when she, you're going to be a leader on talking about sexual harassment and these issues across a broad array of industries, including your home, Capitol Hill. To take a pass on that has its own risks for her, and I think she understands that.
Jennifer, this is one of those cases where a single question in an interview for the New Washington ended up taking on a life of its own. And all over social media, people went and hunted down every last photo of Senator Gillibrand and Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton. What do you make of the response of this single question in a long interview?
Well, I make two things of it. One is, look, obviously it's the context of the moment. We're looking at sexual harassment and sexual assault claims, new ones every day. We had 2 front page stories on the Friday front page of the New York Times, independent stories about independent people concerning misconduct charges. So part of it is just that it's the hot button issue and she's in the center of it. But also there is this interesting proclivity in Washington and maybe in American life where being critical of institutions or individuals that you otherwise revere is immediately picked apart and called hypocritical. There's not a lot of tolerance for nuanced or changed views on people or institutions that you support.
And Jennifer, to go back to the question about Bill Clinton and Gillibrand's answer.
Under those circumstances, there should be a very different reaction. And I think in light of this conversation, we should have a very different conversation about President Trump and a very different conversation about allegations against him than what has been had to date and what's currently being had.
She tries to steer it to President Trump.
How do you think that should proceed?
I think, again, we should have a full conversation about how this behavior is not acceptable, that people in power shouldn't be absolved from this kind of accountability, and have a conversation about accountability in all of these contexts. And I think it's important to have it globally.
In the wake of this conversation around whether or not Al Franken should resign or face an ethics committee, there has also been a renewed conversation about whether President Trump is being properly held accountable for the allegations of sexual misconduct against him. Is that what Gillibrand is calling for here?
I think she is calling for that. I'm sure she's been calling for that all along. Look, it's completely unsurprising that you would pivot in your conversations about these types of accusations back to the president, who, by the way, weighed in quickly and in a hurry on Al Franken, as we all know, which obviously revived the conversations about the allegations against him. And there are many women, not just in politics, who do not feel satisfaction about how those claims were adjudicated, and they don't feel satisfaction about how they were dropped, like so many things that happen in our news cycle, from the conversation for quite a while, and are certainly being revived in the context of Roy Moore, in the context of Al Franken, in the context of Harvey Weinstein, and every industry, but particularly politics, where sexual harassment and assault claims are now being revealed.
And as someone who covers Capitol Hill and understands how news like this cycles, I wonder if, as Gillibrand seemed to be hinting, this ends up being a moment where first Democrats revisit what happened with Bill Clinton and re-reckon with that. And then perhaps after that, Republicans will reckon with the allegations against Trump. Do we think that's how this might actually shape up?
I've been asking myself that same question. I would say two things. When it comes to allegations against lawmakers or people who wish to be lawmakers, there's been a distinction between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats, by and large, have not defended anybody, whether it's a liberal in Hollywood who's donated tons of money to them or Al Franken, a sitting United States Senator, have not defended these actions or tried to come to their rescue in any way. But if you look at Republicans, that's been more complicated. You'll remember when the tape first came out with Trump bragging about assaulting women, there was a lot of very negative reaction from Republicans, Republican women in particular. A lot of people denounced Trump, tried to, even Paul Ryan was critical at the time. And here's what they found out. There was no upside to that. He won anyway. He attacked people who attacked him. It didn't seem to chip away at all with his base. There was a great lesson from that, in that these allegations at that time did very little to damage candidate Trump, President Trump, and generally the party with that party base. Pivoting back to sort of the sacred cow of Bill Clinton in this, Senator Gillibrand's comments were interesting in the sense that she was the first. The question is she the last? I think to some degree, women will watch how she's responded to. I think to some degree, everybody is actually weighing in real time how much power the Clintons actually have in politics, in Democratic politics, in American life right now. I think that's a calculation people will make. They'll think upside versus downside. And of course, they'll have to look into their own conscience about how they actually feel about that time and whether it has evolved.
Well, that's a perfect segue to ask you, 2020, everybody wants to know. Candidate Gillibrand?
Well, as you know, I'm focusing on my Senate race for 18. It's really important that I prove to my state that I want to be their senator and that I want to do the job well. And so I'm asking for their votes. And so I'm focused on 18. And I really encouraged all my colleagues to do the same. Because if you're angry about President Trump, the best way to defeat his worst policies is to flip the Senate and flip the House in 18. And so that's where my focus is.
Listeners will note she didn't say no.
Jennifer, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Anytime, Michael.
The New Washington is produced by Michael Simon Johnson and Michaela Bouchard. Brad Fisher is our engineer. Lisa Tobin is our executive producer. Samantha Hennig is our editorial director. Our theme music is by Jim Brunberg and Ben Landsberg of Wonderland. That's it for The New Washington. See you back here next week.